more serious note, we all in this House, as members, deal with some very tragic cases. And if I can reference a couple of cases, Leah Hayes was a 15-year-old young girl who passed, her life ended in a car park in Northallerton in 2019. Andrew Bellaby, who took his own life at age 35 in 2015. The connection between these two tragic cases is drugs, of course. One suffering adverse reaction, Leah suffering an adverse reaction to her first experiment with drugs, taking ecstasy, very sadly. And Andrew, whose life had been devastated by drug dependency. Trail the tragic cases, and of course we deal with families who are trying to pick up the pieces and try and make the best of it and try to put measures in place to stop these things happening again. And too often we look at ways such as trying to deal with suicide cases more effectively, or in terms of clamping down on the people who deal the drugs. But we're treating the symptoms, not the causes of these problems, of course. These causes, the cause of this, of course, is linked to economic crime. And if you want to know how that happens, and many people will have watched the series Narcos, of course, these big cartels who make a huge amount of money distributing the drugs that cause these tragic cases are making absolutely so much money. In Narcos, they bury the money they're making so much. They bury hundreds of millions of pounds because they've got so much money they don't know what to do with it. And of course, they find difficulty legitimising that money. They can't. What you're not supposed to be able to do, of course, is pay that dodgy money into a bank or even go out and buy a yacht or a house with it, because people should be asking you where that money has come from. So without the ability to launder that money, it is pointless perpetrating these horrendous crimes and being the linchpins behind these tragic cases. But the reality is, many of our large financial organisations facilitate the laundering of that money. And there's a case back in 2012, HSBC, which we look at as a trusted organisation, was fined £1.9 billion for laundering the money for the Sinaloa cartel, which is run by El Chapo, some people know. It is quite incredible that that would happen. And you may ask why they would do that. The obvious reason, of course, is money. That's why they would do it, because the banks themselves can make a huge amount of money. And my husband friend, the member for Barking, mentioned the Danske Bank case. Is that bank, normally a branch, a regional bank, a bank in a division of a bank in a country would make a profit margin of around about 20% on turnover. The Estonian branch that was dealing with the £200 billion that came out of Russia, which is all Russian kleptocrat money, was making a profit margin of 460%. A huge amount of money. And that's the incentive. The point behind all this, of course, it is inconceivable that the people at the top of HSBC or Danske Bank did not know that was going on. The people at the senior level. It is impossible you're making those kinds of extraordinary profit margins and profits without knowing what's going on. Yet what we do time and time again, we simply fine the bank. We don't hold the individuals to account. And this stuff isn't just drugs, of course. Some of the problems we're trying to solve in here, the small boats crisis, traffickers, again, exactly the same. They're making a huge amount of money and they need to be able to move that money around. Paul Stanfield, who is the head of economic crime at Interpol, said his words were, if we want to clamp down on economic crime, it is all about the money. To tackle organised crime, we have to go out after the money. But the reality is, of course, is that we make this much easier. The UK is in a specific place because of some of the lax regulations we have had, and there's no doubt some of our rules are pretty lax, because of the shell companies that we allow this money to be hidden behind the veils of different companies and different jurisdictions, because of the expertise in London as well and their overseas territories. The UK is the destination of choice in terms of where the money will be laundered. The money often goes to different places, but it is laundered through London. So it's very welcome, many of the measures, particularly on that, in terms of Companies House, the transparency that should emanate from the provisions in this bill, and very welcome those measures are too. It is a pretty, as I said earlier in the intervention, it's a pretty big job to do that. What the legislation will say, it's not just new companies that we have to verify the directors of, but existing companies as well. That's millions of companies. And I do question, and I said this to the Minister yesterday, and the Minister has been excellent in his engagement on these issues, as his colleagues, the Security Minister too, as the previous Security Minister was as well, I must say. But I would really like to understand how we're going to do that. Of course, we can say, well, we're putting £63 million into Companies House, but that seems like a big job to me, to be able to verify the information that is through in terms of identity, which is critical, and make sure that the people there are really identified as the people who have significant control over these organisations. It's right, what we've been referenced a couple of times. We think that the resources need to be for Companies House, and it makes, to us, perfect sense to increase that very, very low fee of £12 in terms of setting up a company in the UK to £50 or £100. I've set up quite a lot of companies in my time, and I can't say a fee of 50 quid or 100 quid would deter me from doing that in any shape or form. So I think we should certainly look at that to increase resources to make sure the enforcement happens. Too often in this place we look at innovation, we look at legislation, but we don't look too closely at implementation, and without that it is pointless having this debate at all. So the implementation is key, the resources are key to do that. The measures that are not in here, of course, are the ones we're bound to focus on, because that's what we do as backbenchers. We look at the stuff we're not doing as well as the stuff the government's bringing forward. But as I've said many times in this House and many times outside this House as well, the number one measure that we've got to bring forward is extending the provisions of the failure to prevent provisions, which we included bribery and tax evasion, which have been so effective. I mean, a lot of people say, well, you just talk a lot, you never get anything done. The bribery provisions have been massive in terms of bringing corruption to holding corrupt companies to account. A Serious Fraud Office had deferred prosecution agreements for Rolls-Royce, for Airbus, which was almost £1 billion in fines that came into the Treasury. Also, they had GPT Special Projects, which was a case that was prosecuted by the Serious Fraud Office. Serious Fraud Office doesn't get many successful convictions, but GPT Special Projects pleaded guilty in Southwark Crown Court, I think in 2020, £28 million in financial forfeitures as a result of that. So this stuff works, and that was on the back of the Bribery Act. I pay tribute to the honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, for her work on whistleblowers, because it's another area this bill doesn't cover now, and I very much hope the Minister will bring forward some more provisions. But the key thing in that particular case is my constituent Ian Foxley, who blew the whistle about in 2011, and 10 years later we get the conviction. He was a well-paid person operating in the Middle East for GPT when he blew the whistle. He's had 11 years without any remuneration whatsoever. He was earning probably a couple £100,000 a year, and so he's millions of pounds down. We don't protect whistleblowers, we don't compensate whistleblowers. Absolutely wrong. These are the people who actually identify what's going on. They do the right thing, come forward, and to put not too fine a point on it, we hang them out to dry when they have. Happy to give way.
Does he agree with me that there is a grave injustice where, as he points out, those who have done the right thing have a lifetime loss of earnings of millions of pounds, but a crooked accountant who is called up by the Financial Reporting Council and who is disciplined by them, in those cases, the fact that their loss of earnings through being suspended for a short time could run into millions of pounds is taken into account, and very often the sentence is made more lenient if it's going to have a significant financial impact on an accountant who has given false information to the FRC. Does he agree that it seems to be a case where the crooks are better treated than the people who try to bring them to justice?
Yeah, it makes a very interesting point, and enablers of all kinds is something we need to come down on too, and we need to get tougher in lots of different ways to actually crack down on this in the way we'd all like to see. So you raised a very interesting point. So whistleblowers, yes, and I know it won't be part of this bill, but we want those things brought forward as quickly as possible, although there may be amendments laid to that effect. But just back to failure to prevent, this is so important. When we failure to prevent has got to include the ability to hold an individual director to account. And if that happens, the incidence of money laundering and this facilitation of all kinds of different offences, these huge profits that are made out of drug dealing or other things, will start to reduce. And an illustration of this is what happened in health and safety legislation back in 1974, when we made individual directors individually responsible, so they could go to jail if they didn't prevent or seek to prevent serious injuries on their building sites. So it became a health and safety offence. It could be pinned on the individual. After that happened, deaths and serious injuries dropped by 90%. This would have the biggest effect I can think of all the other measures we've talked about today in terms of cutting down on economic crime, because lots of our financial organisations are complicit when it suits their interest to be so. There are many other things we should do as well. We should extend what we did in terms of the unexplained wealth orders, in terms of cost protection, to things like property freezing orders, recovery orders, other elements of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Interestingly, we should, an interesting idea about Bill Browder, who's very outspoken in these cases. He's come with the interesting idea: if an individual is sanctioned, anyone who has dealt with that individual, it be accountant or a solicitor or whatever, should have to hand over their records in connection with that individual to the authorities. In that way, you can start to track down the money more effectively. I can't see why there's a good argument against that. We've talked about freezing and seizing assets. It's difficult to do this because clearly you've got to prove there was a crime. And we do believe in property rights and the rule of law in the UK, so taking it off individual oligarchs is tough. One thing that seems like pretty much an open goal is we hold about £30 billion in Russian foreign currency reserves. And it's quite clear that Russia is guilty of international crimes in terms of its invasion of Ukraine. We could legislate to make sure that money is not just frozen, as it is currently. It is confiscated, it is seized and used to pay reparations to Ukraine. There are many other things we could do, which I'll talk further on at the later stages of this legislation, and we may well table one or two amendments, which I very much hope the government will, the ministers will continue to engage